So, whether you've walked the halls of a university as a student, maybe grappled with research papers, or you're just curious about how knowledge actually gets made, you've probably bumped up against the, let's say, interesting world of academia,
Hmm.
and you're likely looking for the key ideas, the big picture, without wading through tons of dense text, right?
Absolutely.
Well, you're definitely in the right place. This deep dive, it's really designed to get straight to the heart of things.
And today we're digging into a pretty challenging perspective on that world. It comes from the economist and futurist Robin Hanson, specifically from a conversation he had on the Kurt Jai-Mungal Show.
Okay.
Our mission really is to understand why Hanson argues the current academic setup is, well, he says, broken, and then explore his pretty radical ideas for fixing it.
We're talking peer review, tenure, grant funding,
Yeah,
big stuff.
exactly, those core pillars.
And you know what really struck me looking at our sources was how new these systems actually are. Peer review, tenure as we know it.
Right, they feel ancient, foundational.
But they mostly became dominant only around the mid-20th century. Before that, things look quite different. Accountability often came from outside academia more directly.
Which is a key part of Hanson's argument, actually.
Okay, so let's jump in. What's the absolute core problem Hanson sees?
With central idea, it boils down to accountability. Or maybe a shift in accountability.
A shift? How so?
He argues that peer review, tenure, and how grants work now, they've kind of unintentionally created this bubble. Academia has become more insular.
Focused inward.
Yeah, focused on internal validation, on what other academics think, less accountable perhaps to the outside world or, societal needs. The incentive shifted towards internal prestige.
Prestige over, say, real innovation or solving problems.
That's the gist of his concern, yeah. Sometimes, potentially, at the expense of truly groundbreaking work.
Okay, let's take tier review. We always hear it's the gold standard, right, for quality control. But Hanson sees issues.
He does. He acknowledges the intent is good, ensuring rigor. But he argues it inherently favors, well, safe research. Research that fits the current consensus. Ideas that don't rock the boat too much. Really novel concepts, the ones that could change everything. They often challenge the existing views.
So they might get blocked by the system.
They could struggle, yeah. He even uses the example, kind of speculatively, of Einstein. Would his revolutionary papers have made it through a really strict, modern peer review system?
Interesting thought. Maybe only through an editor taking a chance?
Potentially. So, from Hanson's angle, peer review might accidentally filter out the most radical, important new ideas.
Okay. And then there's tenure, job security for academics. What's the critique there?
So he definitely gets the main point of tenure protecting academic freedom. That's crucial. It lets scholars study unpopular things without fear.
Right.
But he also points out that this long-term security can possibly reduce the pressure for external accountability over time. Well, once you have tenure, maybe the drive to produce work that really impacts the world outside your specific field. Maybe that lessens. The focus might shift more to, internal university politics, getting the next grant, keeping status among peers.
Instead of pushing boundaries in a way society benefits from.
That's the potential downside he highlights. It's a balancing act, isn't it?
It seems so. Now, this next bit is fascinating. He compares our grant system to how prizes used to work. Can you break that down?
Yeah, this is really about when the reward comes. Historically, big prizes were often given after a major breakthrough was proven.
After the results were in.
Exactly. So that naturally incentivized researchers to focus on long-term goals, on getting tangible results. The reward was tied to the impact.
Right, and grants.
Grants are given before the work starts, based on a proposal. They're essential for funding, obviously. But Hanson argues institutions often prefer grants.
Why?
Because landing big grants brings immediate prestige to the university. It looks good right now. And grants also give institutions more say in directing the research money.
So the focus shifts from rewarding proven success to funding, well, potential.
Yeah, or maybe funding things that look good on paper now, which, as Hanson implies, isn't always the same as funding what will matter most later.
Okay, so if grants aren't perfect, what's Hanson's really out there solution? Prediction markets for academia. Explain that.
Right, this is where it gets really forward-thinking, maybe even a bit sci-fi. He suggests using prediction markets, basically. Betting markets where people wager on future outcomes.
Like betting on elections or sports.
Sort of, yeah. But apply it to academic impact. Imagine a market where people bet on Which researchers working today will historians in, say, 100 or 200 years see as the most important?
Wow. Okay. And the payout.
The payout isn't cash tomorrow. It's determined by those future historians, by the actual long-term legacy and influence of the work.
That is radically different. How on earth would that change academia?
Well, the potential impact is huge. First, you'd get this external signal of long-term value, something outside the control of current academic gatekeepers.
So universities couldn't just ignore it.
Probably not. If a university kept hiring people the market ranked really low for long-term impact, they'd face questions, right? They'd have to justify it.
Makes sense. What else?
It could push academics themselves to think more about lasting impact, not just the next publication or fitting the current fad.
Focus on the long game.
Exactly. And third, it might democratize things a bit.
Yep.
People outside the usual academic circles, if they've insight into long-term trends, could influence these market evaluations.
It sounds really disruptive, but surely there are huge roadblocks.
Oh, absolutely. Hanson points them out himself. The biggest is likely resistance from established institutions.
They wouldn't want to lose control.
Precisely. Their prestige is tied to the current system. Prediction markets could threaten that. And journals, grant agencies, their incentives often favor reputation now, maybe findings that are new but not too disruptive.
Which doesn't align with a 100-year market view.
Not necessarily. And fundamentally, why would powerful institutions just give up control over hiring and evaluation to some external market? There's not much incentive for them to do that.
So where could it even start?
Hanson kind of suggests it might have to begin at the edges, maybe newer universities, less established ones, or even just groups of researchers trying it out experimentally.
He also suggested something less drastic as a first step, didn't he? Something about looking back.
Yes, exactly. A more practical starting point. He suggests doing detailed retrospective studies.
How'd that work?
Get historians to really systematically assess the impact of past researchers. Use different methods, different criteria. See if they generally agree on who was truly important over the long haul.
So test if long-term importance is even a measurable thing.
Basically, yes. If different approaches lead to roughly similar rankings of past figures, it builds a case that, yeah, we can identify lasting impact looking back.
Which would make the idea of predicting it seem less crazy.
It would lay some groundwork, build some credibility for the prediction market idea down the line, show the concept isn't totally arbitrary.
Okay, so after all these critiques, peer review issues, tenure downsides, grant incentives, does Hanson really think broken is the right word for academia today?
He makes a strong case for why he uses that term. He draws a parallel with, say, healthcare, particularly in the U.S.
How so?
Well, you see massive spending in healthcare, a huge chunk of the economy. Yet, studies often suggest a lot of that spending doesn't clearly lead to better health outcomes for the population.
A lot of waste or inefficiency.
Right, a kind of systemic inefficiency maybe, coupled with difficulty in the system correcting itself. Hanson argues academia might be similar.
Despite all the resources and brainpower.
Yeah, huge inputs, but are the outputs in terms of real progress, societal benefit always proportional? He questions if the system is allocating resources effectively, hence the term broken.
So wrapping up Hanson's view, he sees academia as having drifted, maybe become too self-focused due to how peer review, tenure, and grants evolved.
Less accountable externally than it perhaps once was.
And his big radical fix is prediction markets, aiming to refocus incentives on long-term impact and transparency.
Even though he knows it faces massive hurdles. It's a real challenge to the way things are done now.
He's definitely asking us to question if the systems we take for granted are the best way to find and share knowledge.
Absolutely.
Which leaves a pretty big question for you listening. If these dominant structures, peer review, tenure, grants, are actually quite recent in the long history of thought, what other basic assumptions are we making, in any field?
Yeah, assumptions about how we create knowledge, how we decide what's valid.
Is there always a tension between having established processes, which we need, and allowing space for those truly radical, game-changing ideas? Something to think about.
Definitely. And if you want to really get into the weeds of Hanson's arguments, hear it all from him. We've put a link to that original Kurt Jai-Mungal interview. It's quite the listen.